Greg Leonardo on Deploying the Azure Way.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello again, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. Go to www.azuredevops.show to see past episodes and show notes. Our guest today is Greg Leonardo. He is the cloud architect at Campus Management Corporation and Webonology. And Greg's main focus is to help organizations with cloud adoption and innovation. And yes, if this sounds familiar, Greg was on the show probably just about a month ago. We did not get through everything, and so we're having him on again. But Greg's been working in the IT industry since his time in the military, way back 1993 era, as a developer, teacher, speaker, and early adopter, and works in many facets of the IT industry throughout his career. He's currently the president of TampaDev, a community meetup that runs hashtag TampaCC for Tampa Code Camp, a Azure User Group, Azure Medics, and various technology events throughout Tampa. And we're here talking about some of the topics in his book, his new book, Hands-on Cloud Solutions with Azure, Architecting, Developing, and Deploying the Azure Way. So, Greg, welcome back.
Thank you, sir. How you doing?
I'm good. And if you didn't catch the part one of Greg's podcast, just go to azuredevops.show and you can look at that, because we ran out of time and we didn't get to cover everything that's in the book. A lot of great stuff. So we're here to finish the job.
Well, you and I talk a lot when we get together, so it's all good.
Right. And if any veterans are listening to the podcast, go back and listen to the other one, because we talked about vets and tech a bit, as well as other things. But we're talking about deploying to Azure, which is different from just deploying to VMs that happen to be in some data center somewhere, because Azure's different. So why don't you, Greg, prime the pump again about what's unique about deploying to Azure specifically?
Well, Azure specifically is one of those things that you have to learn to deploy to, and you want to automate your deployments, because you don't have a lot of access to the back-end things that you're used to. Like when you deploy to a server, you can always look at the server logs, other different things that you can't really do in Azure, out of the box. Nobody wants to look at Logstreamer trying to figure out why their app service didn't deploy right or anything like that. So to me, you want to make things more predictable in Azure, and you want to make them easier. You want to be able to almost stamp them out in the same. So you want to make the same Lego sculpture over and over and over again. And that's really what your automated deploys do. When you go to Azure, you're just changing, which resource group you're deploying to. So,
yeah. One of the things that I think we don't talk about enough is just the ability to not have to care and feed for an operating system and do security patches and maintain that. Just not having to own the operating system itself.
Yeah. I think you and I talked about that in the first segment. I remember back in the day, I was in teaching a group of folks how to, get into Azure, and I had some developers and I had some operation guys, and one of the operations guys looked at me and he goes, why are you trying to eliminate my job? And I kind of looked at him and I said, so you like getting up on Friday nights in the middle of the night to fix a server or roll out a patch? And he goes, well, no. And I'm like, so cool. If I could take that out of your visibility, would that make you better? And he goes, yeah. And I go, cool. Welcome to Azure. I'm like, Azure's there to enhance your experience, not to take it away. It's to get rid of the mundane things that you really don't want to do, so that you can focus in on what's important to your organization and you, versus, you always having to get up and be starved for sleep simply because you have to, support and service pack and do all of these things for these OSs that you don't need to do anymore.
Yeah. That's similar to back that I don't remember the time when people drove, horse and buggy, but there's no buggies anymore drawn by horses to get around. But there is the same job that there's taxi drivers, there's limo drivers, there's bus drivers, there's train operators. There is still the job of a person to help someone else get from point A to point B, but it's not driving the horse and buggy. I think I heard the story of the railroad company that all the railroads went out of business, but there were a few companies that realized they were in the transportation business, not just the railroad business. So they kind of made the trucking transition. It's just about we're in the business to run software, not care and feed for a security patch.
Yep. And you and I learned that many moons ago, starting out in the developer arena. As frameworks came up, we had to stop worrying about writing screens and, making windows and, doing those things. We could rely on, these frameworks to do that for us. So things were extracted out of Vue. It didn't make us any less useful. It actually made us more useful because we were able to focus in on the application than all the little plumbing that went into that application. So it was actually a really neat transition.
Yeah. All right. So in Azure, we have different types of environments. Infrastructure as code is one of those topics, the buzzwords people are throwing around. And even if the servers are on VMware in a Rackspace data center or somewhere else, automatically provisioning new environments and automatically changing those environments is a critical piece of the DevOps mindset, as opposed to manually provisioning and manually changing. So, what do people need to know about how that applies to Azure?
Well, in Azure, you have several ways to kind of approach these things. One of the ways I've looked at it is you can create ARM templates that'll deploy environments, and you can point environments at it. You can use run books to deploy your environments and things like that. But looking at your desired state scripts and looking at things from setting up your environment once the provisioning's done. I mean, it's always easy nowadays to stand up a VM in Azure, but it's not real easy to connect it to a domain or have it do an enhanced functionality because you need to install software on it or something like that. So that's where you kind of start looking at how these migrations go. Usually folks will pick up things for moving steel over or taking existing VMs and then just moving them to Azure and standing them back up. But it's also being able, giving yourself the ability to tear down these environments. At the end of the day, you should be able to rebuild any environment through a release pipeline, or from a backup or something like that. But release pipeline should be able to, generate and create any environment that you need. Let's start talking about cost, right? Do you really need to have a persistent environment forever when you're testing software once a year? Let's say you're a tax company, right? You only do a testing once a year. So why have a persistent infrastructure? Why don't you just run a run book or a ARM template to generate that, test your code, then move it out, and then tear the environment back down?
So talk about these run books for people who might not have ever used them before.
Yep. Run books are just ways for you to create steps to generate your environment. So one of the things that I do today is I have a run book that generates our entire environment because it's VM based, it's IaaS. So the run book itself just runs through different steps for generating things. It starts generating the VMs, then it starts installing SQL. Then it does a whole bunch of different things that it needs to do. And the reason it installs SQL is because we have a very specific version. So we install on those VMs, and we're working on getting it up to the latest and greatest. So, but it's really what you typically think. It's a run book. It runs through steps and it generates your environment based off those steps. The one that I currently run today takes about 3.5 hours to run to generate the environment, and it stands up roughly 22 VMs running various software packages on each one of the VMs, including 4 PaaS services that sit in that arena as well. So, VNets and everything to support that environment.
So the scripts to create these environments, do they reside in Azure or do they reside in your Git repository?
Nope, they reside in Azure inside of one of our runbook repositories that we check in and out. We actually have a Git that backs them up in order to keep track of source code. But yeah, they're generally run out of Azure, and we have different versions depending on the version of the infrastructure that we're trying to put in play around the different modules. This will change for us as an evolution because most of the people that cloud adopt evolve, right? So we started out with the VMs, and then we figured out, okay, now that we've got all these VMs there, we're now going to PaaS. So the next evolution is we're no longer going to deploy the VMs anymore. We're going to go ahead and push out, PaaS-based services. So we're going to take everything out of IIS and then publish as a PaaS service. What people figure out is there's certain things in DLLs and third-party arenas that don't work very well in Azure, and you have to create unique ways to make them work. So it's just kind of getting over some hurdles. And sometimes that may be, kicking a third-party vendor to the curb simply because they're not supported in a multi-tenanted environment or something like that. So, there's a lot of things that have to be answered when you go from VM to, PaaS-based.
Okay. That sounds like a pretty big project, because there's all kinds of, when a piece of software has been around for a long time and it's run on a full Windows operating system for a long time, there tends to be code that crops up that kind of expects it to be there. Maybe a little code that reads or writes something from the registry or a file system in a certain place, or just.
Yep.
So what have you found?
Well, I found a lot of different things. I mean, when you go in, you tend to find little bugs like somebody created a service account that nobody knew about, or there is some task manager running somewhere that's doing something in the background that nobody knew about. Looking at third-party DLLs, things around, you had PDF generators that haven't been updated since the 90s, and they just kept using them because you didn't need to change them on the box. But you go to Azure and you don't have the same abilities in Azure that you did locally. So there's just a lot of little gotchas that come out of it. Generally, what I do as my first practice is I take the IIS deployment that we have set up to deploy to the servers, and I just point it at a PaaS and I click the deploy button and I see what happens.
See what happens. See what exceptions happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then adjust from there.
There was this era when phone systems were very much hardware based. Where if today you want to set up a new 1-800 number or whatnot, you probably go to ringcentral.com or one of the competitors, and just everything's virtual right out of the gate. Phone system as a service. But if you were doing this around the turn of the millennium and you were integrating with software, you have a PCI card plugged into the motherboard of a server, and then you have phone lines, circuits routed into the data center, and then you have their SDK or a library that you're integrating with. And so it's not just, I'm calling this API. It's your code has to be run on a server that has a specific hardware component installed. And so there's so much, if the system's been around for, over a decade, there's going to be all kinds of things.
Yep. One of my biggest hurdles was at a healthcare client. They wanted to move to Azure, but they were static routed. So they had to learn this thing called dynamic routing before they could move, because they tried to pump all this, they tried to create VPN connections, all these different things. And it was like, you can't do that. You need to be dynamically routed. But we don't understand that. And it's like, well, you need to come up to the 2000s a little bit so that you could work your way through it. So, everybody has their learning ways, and some of these ways are just bad habits that over years have transitioned and not changed, because in our tech field, we've gotten so accustomed to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which is a different paradigm when you start going to the cloud, because modernization is the key today, and making sure your application stays with the not the latest and greatest, but kind of the best of breed, and give it the ability to self-heal and easily be deployed, recover from errors where you and I lived through the error with the big red X coming up on the screen, and we're like, okay, where do we start? And having to dig that stuff out. Nowadays, you want to make sure that things fail gracefully. They're able to recover. They can self-heal, and the applications have really become very smart in today's day and age. It's been amazing to me to see the transition.
Yeah. Well, and I think deployments are, when you can deploy something in an automated fashion, then you do it more often, and then it's no big deal to have, say, 2 applications instead of 1, because you're not feeling double the pain of deployment. Where if deploying is hard and you don't want to do it very often, do you think that you're going to have a second Visual Studio solution so that you have 2 of these applications to deploy? Heck no. We're going to have only 1, and we're going to jam everything inside the same application. And guess what? It becomes huge. And that's where the monolithic architecture has become notorious, and why we have all these systems that are just these huge beasts.
Yep. Yep. And you and I have been around that block enough to see the headaches and hurdle of change across an organization, because sometimes it just doesn't have to do with Azure anymore. Sometimes you have hybrid models that work on-prem and in Azure, and your deployments have to take in a multiple faceted ecosystem to handle its deploy, and not just one thing. Back in the day, I mean, hell, I remember, the days of us, create a zip file. You move the zip file to the server, you explode it, you copy these files into here,
Yeah.
you fire it up and you go, dang it, I forgot to change these 4 config settings. And, you spend hours troubleshooting in production your deployment because you forgot to add the configuration files to it, or, something was goofy. To today's day and age, you just go out and you just say, I want to create a new environment. Let me click on this button here. Let me set this up. Here's the new app service. Go to deploy, come back, 30 minutes later, and your whole environment stood up, and you didn't have to muck with anything. It knew how to change its config around. It knew how to set its variables. It knew how to pull things in. It knew how to use the infrastructure that you created versus you having to tell it to use that infrastructure. So just the smarts behind all of this stuff has really been phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So once we have environments running in Azure, we need to know what the heck they're doing. And there's this talk around Azure Monitor and logging, but give us the lowdown on that piece.
Well, generally, when you look at it, you have to think of it the same way you did internal. So when I do a lot of my training and transition between internal to external, you had event logs, which is AI, right? So when you set up a service or a resource in Azure, it's connected to AI. AI starts collecting telemetry about it, which is like the event log, when things are happening for what it can see and things like that. And then you have all of these different now disparate app insights areas all over the place that don't coagulate up, right? So you think of it like all of your servers. Jeff now needs to go log into server A to check the event log to find out why something's not going, or he has to put a monitor on this box. So it was very, single server centric. Then you came out with MOM and SCOM and all of these things that now grabbed all of these different logs and brought them into one server, and then got everything set up to where you could monitor and do everything from one spot. That's the same way it is in Azure. You've got your app insights that's tracking all the telemetry about your application, all its perf mons, all its little things, so you can create really cool dashboards. But then you have log analytics and all these different things that do all of these roll-ups that take all of those app insights, roll them up into one, and give you one central area to create your monitoring, to create your dashboards from, to create different avenues. And one thing I've learned from that is that comes at a cost, right? Everything costs money. You're never going to get away with free for too long. So teaching people how to break their workspaces up to where you have production and dev and QA, and you handle each one of those differently so that you don't drive up your cost. I mean, one of the things we ran into in Campus is we had cost overrun with our app insights and our log rollup, and it caught us off guard because it was collecting a lot of good telemetry, but we didn't expect the ramp up in cost. So we had to kind of go separate that. And what happened was that somebody thought it would really be cool to roll everything up to one log analytics. So they took all of our dev, all of our QA, all of our different sites. Well, that wasn't a good thing, because dev and QA have a lot of errors that may or may not be real. That were going into the same repository that we were trying to do monitoring off of. So this, the smart AI, or the artificial intelligence that's trying to do all the smart alerting, is now trying to do it based off of known errors. So it's creating all of this log management nightmare in Azure that blew up our costs. I mean, we were generating 400 to 500 megabytes of log management data per day. So it was just spiking the thing way up. So, we had to learn things like, getting enterprise agreements in place, looking at better ways of covering your nodes, how to roll things up, properly by keeping the stuff over in the free arena, maybe not turning a lot of alerting on in the dev and QA environments because it's not needed. So we had to sit down and kind of cut everything up and move everything around to get the cost down again.
All right. So let's break down these pieces. You've got, let's just keep it simple. An application, you got app service and say Azure SQL, and that. So for each one of those, what do you need? You're starting with application insights. Yep. So what are the rules? What are where you use one for many applications versus you need one per application?
Well, generally, I allow App Insights to spin up by resource because I view that as its event log. Then I use roll-up workspaces. They used to call it OMS. It's called Log Analytics now, to where you roll those things up. So you connect to all of your different App Insights, and then you pull data out of those App Insights to do your monitoring and your dashboards and things like that, to kind of trap the things that are important to you. So it's kind of a walk-up thing. When you're in a dev environment, you only really need App Insights because you're going to a single PaaS service or a single something because you're single-threaded. So you're going to log into your App Insights and you're going to, find out what's going on or what errors are coming up with it. When you're looking at something more from a QA or prod side, you want these things to roll up so that you're able to transition those logs and get higher end logs and monitoring over to the devs so the devs know where all the problems are at. So I think it's kind of like a twofold. Monitoring is a strap on and everything is an extension of the log analytics side, including, security monitoring and things like that. All of those are from the logs that are being collected in the background. They're just picking out little finite points that they want to go in and manage, like security on one side, everything else on the other. So it's actually really cool around that.
Okay, so you like having every resource have its own application insights instance.
Well, I go with every application to have its own App Insights.
Okay.
But generally, if they can create their own, I let them create their own and then roll them up later.
So if you had an application, a Visual Studio solution that was built and deployed, but it was a web application, 2 Azure functions and a database, would that be 4 or 1 application insights instance?
I would create one.
Okay.
And that would be for the application as a whole because I create them by application. So I usually put the container of development around the application as a whole, but there have been instances where I've kind of broken that up too. And it really all depends on the training and the gap for the people that you're used to working with, right? If I have guys that are only going to work on the functions and are only going to have access to them, then I kind of want to split out their workspaces for that as well. I don't want them to get the noise of what's happening in the web application if they're not. So it really depends how these teams are broken up. 9 times out of 10, though, it's usually done by groups. So usually I put them in a group. So I create a resource group that has its own App Insights so that everybody knows what, everything is self-contained in the resource group.
Okay. And then the log analytics. Do you roll up multiple applications to that?
Yes.
Okay.
I do all production applications into that because that's more like your old mom and SCOM heavy workspaces where you're monitoring your entire ecosystem. You want to be able to do your application maps and see how your applications are performing. And that's across the organization, not just, inside the arena of a single app or a single thread. But again, that comes with a caveat. That depends how the organization is broken up from a support perspective. Because remember, everything in Azure is based off of access and how you want to give people access to it. So I generally look at these things like I know at campus, we roll everything up into one. So everything, all of our applications roll up into one so that we can keep track of our entire ecosystem. But we only have one operation support structure for that then trickles it down. So that's easy for us. You go to somebody like, a Microsoft or a Google that may have multiple plateaus. They may not want to do that model. They may roll them up by facets. And I mean by, O365 versus, OS or Azure. And they may want to break things up a little bit differently because of how their support structure is.
Well, at some point it's too big. And you can imagine Microsoft being probably too big.
Yeah.
How many production Azure subscriptions do you run?
We run 147 right now.
Okay. So one of the subscriptions has the log analytics service running, and then App Insights from all of the other subscriptions are connected to this log analytics service.
Right. But based off of different workspaces. So there's only 83 of them that are production based. So those 83 are connected to the production workspace, and then the others are connected to the non-production workspaces.
Yeah. I think a lot of organizations that, at least we see ones that are new to Azure, they get the budget approval and then they create their Azure subscription. And then they just assume, oh, well, we just need one. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they can't sort out what's in there anymore.
Right. Well, see, I'm a toss up, right? So the way I look at subscriptions, because there are resources in Azure that have subscription boundaries that are hard, right? So it always, behooves you to understand if those limits are going to negatively impact you, right? I worked at one company that wanted to do an express route. Well, express route only goes to one subscription, right? And you have to create VPNs over. So if you have 180 different subscriptions that need to use that, now you have 180 VPNs you now have to monitor, and another point of failure. So you've got to really look at what's important to you. There is no magic wand to say a lot of subscriptions will work for you or one subscription will work for you. It really depends on what you're trying to do. I generally stay into the customer matrix, right? Because being a consultant. So I create a subscription per customer because I may have to give it back. I may have to move it. And I want to move that thing as a whole. I don't want to try to move the little parts and little pieces. So it really depends on what you're trying to do with it.
Yeah, I haven't found an organization where only a single Azure subscription would work for the whole company.
Right. Well, I've been in one, and it was a medical company, and they only had about, I don't know, maybe 8 applications total that they used to run the organization. So to me, I was like, you're trying to create 8 separate subscriptions versus having one and using resource groups to kind of isolate those subscriptions. And you want to use ExpressRoute to build your hybrid model. I would just go with one subscription, connect it over, let your non-prod subscriptions connect via VPN to use it, and then call it a day. That way they didn't have to, because these guys were new to Azure too. So you're talking about, the dev side created all these subscriptions sideways, and then the poor operation guys are going, what'd you give us? We now have all these like little pieces we have to connect up, monitor, set up, and it got to be crazy. So we had to find that happy medium to make both sides happy.
Yeah. And that express route's a pretty big dependency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Greg, we've talked about deploying to Azure, infrastructure as code, provisioning environments, and how to watch your environment's telemetry. What else do developers targeting Azure need to know?
Well, a lot of them need to know is that set up your Azure environments for remote debug. Allow yourself when you're developing to be able to connect over to them and remote debug. Trying to solve everything local may not work in 100% of the scenarios. Always connect your local environments to SQL. I'm kind of getting out of the realm of having local SQL when I talk to Azure, simply because of little road bumps I've always hit with having to transition from a local SQL to an Azure SQL. So it's easier to me just to, I don't even install SQL local anymore. I put the Management Studio to connect to Azure, and I run all of my databases out of Azure, including local, I'm doing the air quotes, the local versions that I need to for, my own development before I push them to a dev integration environment. So, simply because you want to overcome all the different hurdles that may, come in from an Azure perspective. You want to automate. I know that's not always possible. You may have to do a POC to where you're doing your deploy local, but and running your deploy directly from Visual Studio, but don't persist that. If that's something that you got a POC, as soon as your POC goes up, figure out how to get it in a pipeline and use ADO for that. Don't persist that problem and become the single threaded, you have to deploy it all the time guy. Even in small environments, I know it's easy to do, but I'm telling you, if you learn how to do it and you get the things automated, you'll never look back again.
Yeah,
ever.
Absolutely. And acronym police, you said ADO, you mean
Azure DevOps.
Which I'm not.
Sorry.
So many people are. I don't think the acronym has come to rest just yet. I see a lot of ASDO running around.
Well, that in a corporate environment, it's easier to say ADO, even though every time I keep hearing it, I keep thinking of the old ADO data model. But that's beside the point.
But if you're not so long in the tooth, then you have no idea that there's another acronym for ADO.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're showing our age now, but we can start talking about all these little acronyms. They're like, I remember that one.
It seems like every one of these shows, no matter what guest I'm talking to, there always comes up of back in my day, way back here, we used to do. But history's good too. I like talking about the mainframe and what the mainframe did to the whole industry. Versus the multi-terminal mainframe that gave rise to the need for this DevOps movement. I mean,
exactly.
Why do we need to bring two things back together? What the heck separated them? And I contend it was that stupid mainframe with the multi-use terminal.
Well, I remember when JavaScript was called DHTML.
Oh, that's right. And Internet Explorer 5 was the best at running DHTML.
Exactly. I was going to get shirts made that say "Bring back the WebBot," but
that's right, the Webot. Okay, yeah. Internet Explorer. Gosh, back in when was it? 2000, 2001. There were no other good browsers. I mean, Chrome. Chrome was kind of dominant today. But that's just the reality. The best browser was Internet Explorer 5 and 5.1.
Well, I remember that company Netscape that created some browser that kind of went away.
Yeah. Yes, and that's
and
right.
They had Northern Light search engine, if you remember that.
Oh, vaguely. Well, just what you did. Today you create. Let's see. You can use Xcode to create a native iOS application for one type of phone. Then you create Java to do a native mobile application for another type of phone. So, well, in the early IE3 and Netscape 3 days in the late 90s, you created two web applications because you needed to run on Netscape and you needed to run on IE3, and the two it was so impractical to get it to run on both in the same code base. Whereas now we're just like that with smartphones and tablets. You got to create two web. But Xamarin, man, I sure hope that we coalesce around Xamarin and have one. And we've done so many clients where that Xamarin application for business applications on native smartphone and native tablet, it really works well. It's amazing.
Yep. I'm telling you, because we were giggling, but I do remember those days where you had that little JavaScript function that would come out and go, if IE, go here. Yeah. If Netscape, go here.
That's right. That was JavaScript.
DHTML.
Well, I did a ton of that table auto binding with the table head and the T head and the T body and XML data islands.
Yep. Well, I'm sure you remember that, when we used to have to connect to the internet when we were younger, we could listen to the modem to tell whether it was going to connect or not.
That's right. You could hear it. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Nowadays, I was making fun with my kids because I'm like, all the stuff that you don't know about the internet that I should go back and show you one day on how we've gotten here.
Right.
Because my kids think, they're 14 and 10, and they think this technology has been around forever. So they were like, when you were younger, this must have really been cool. And I'm like, dude, we didn't have this stuff when we were younger. Yeah. When I was 12 and 13 years old, we had gotten our first computer, which was a K Pro 2+2. And, and I had gotten a Commodore 64, which actually at the time I got the 128 that never really took off because it had the video toaster where you could play actual video games. And the only game I played on it was Raid Over Moscow.
Okay. I played a sailing racing game, like a regatta game.
Right.
That. I remember that.
Yeah, I did that, and I did Lemmings. Remember Lemmings?
I do remember.
We had to rescue all the Lemmings.
Yeah. Before they jumped off the cliff.
Yep.
Basic. I remember the basic gorilla game. The gorilla throwing the bananas, and because you had the source code, you could modify the game. So that was fun. I bet you could get that QBasic gorilla game running on the Azure terminal.
Yep, I bet you could too.
You can.
I was going to go out and try. Remember our first screensaver where you'd put print Greg Leonardo and then 20 go to 10, and it would print your name out on the screen.
Yes, which it really wasn't a screensaver for energy efficiency. It actually ran the CPU at full speed, using up as much power as possible.
Hey, who knew?
Hey, but you had to save that Hercules graphics.
Exactly.
You didn't want to imprint on your CRT.
Nope.
All right.
Oh, I remember those too. I remember the 17-inch CRTs that we had to go moving around every time you wanted to move your desk or something like that. You had that 400-pound monitor you had to move.
Right. Okay. Now here's the modern challenge in Azure, because Azure deprecated the remote app service where you could run just desktop applications. There's desktop applications that are out there. They're mission critical, and believe it or not, there's a lot of big desktop systems that were even written in Access, and we need a way in Azure to run desktop applications and just kind of emulate the screen over. Do you know of any replacement for remote app?
Nope. I looked at that and I go, yes, I actually do. It's called a Windows Desktop VM.
Yeah.
But I think the push is to modernize. I think Microsoft kind of did some of the things right in looking down and going, well, you know what? We're going to do Azure, but we're not going to have it support everything. And I think that's kind of a right way to look at some things, because if you look at having to support everything all the way back, could you imagine where Azure would be today? If it needed to support everything, we wouldn't have the advancements that we'd have, because we'd have everything so dog-eared like we did with the desktop. If you remember when they went through to do like 95 and they started doing these desktops, they had to drop support simply because it was killing the OSs trying to support, 30, 40 years of, bad development, in a desktop. So,
yeah.
Do I think there's something that needs to be done? Yeah. But I think that something that needs to be done is they need to hire guys like me and you to come in and modernize that app and get it up to date, because taking something from an Access DB to a SQL to a web app is really nothing anymore. I mean, you can take that, suck it right in a SQL, use your scaffolding to generate a MVC website off of it and publish it to Azure and be done. So I really believe that they're kind of going in and are getting out of that arena, which Apple had dropped many moons ago. If you notice, Apple doesn't support things for very long.
Right.
So I'm thinking that, that was their hell, even Google doesn't do it, for very long. But, Microsoft had always been really good at, decades worth of backwards compatibility. And, now that they've stopped that, I see a lot of moving forward, and a lot of modernization that companies needed to do. So I think it's a good thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, the Windows operating system has done a fantastic job in backwards compatibility, but the paradigm shift of having the important computer being in your office to the important computers being kind of up in the cloud, Microsoft's data set, that paradigm shift is kind of like the shift from mainframe to desktop PCs. And, COBOL was tied to the mainframe and just it couldn't make the transition. It's not that COBOL, anything was wrong with COBOL. It was stuck in the previous era. And there's some things that are going to be stuck in the desktop PC era that just can't make the transition as is to the cloud era.
And I even thought about that when you look at things like gaming and stuff like that, those are still things that are going to be local. Are they getting some phones there? Are they getting some games there? Yes. But at the end of the day, everybody still wants the experience for that. So I don't know if desktops will ever holistically go away, because I'll tell you right now, I'm a gamer. I like gaming on my phone. I like gaming on my Xbox, but nothing beats a PC. When you want to sit down with the multiple monitors and being able to do multiple things at once, just nothing's going to beat it. And going back to your point on the the most important thing, you're never going to stop that, because I worked at a company back at the day where the CFO's machine wasn't really on the network, and he had all of these things. Well, his laptop crashed one day, and come to find out, he had all these important applications that nobody knew about.
Uh-huh.
So at the end of the day, maybe this will be that light to come in and go, don't do things the business doesn't know about. Don't build things in such a way that the business can't support it from a long-term perspective, because a lot of these homegrown apps that you're talking about are done more out of necessity than out of true planning. It was somebody read a book somewhere, they went in, they created a extract from SQL to Access, and they created a form to generate a report. They didn't tell anybody about it. And when that stuff dies or goes away, nobody knows where it's at. Nobody knows how to take ownership of it. So I think today's day and age is application development isn't as cumbersome as it used to be. The deployment of those applications isn't as cumbersome as it used to be. So now do your planning so that you can do the same application but have it more durable and more protected in Azure just by doing it the right way. So I think that's the bigger key. Is solving these problems the right way at the end of the day is going to future-proof you from being able to having to worry about that app 5 or 10 years from now. So
yeah,
just a thought.
No, you're totally right. There's always going to be a need for a native experience, which is just rich, stateful, can cache information, and regardless of what form it comes in, you don't want to have to make a round trip over your network every time you tap the screen or click a mouse or hit a keystroke.
Yep. Remember, they have stuff for that. That's those old Max Terms and Citrix clients. They already have that, to where you can have, desktops that aren't really quote unquote desktops, but they found out that the experience isn't as nice trying to support these applications. So we use a couple of them in the cloud now, where we use a Citrix environment to do a lot of that. So going back to your point before, you can run things in Citrix environments, but remember, Citrix only supports some things too. So
yeah, and there's a lot of mainframe terminal users who use the terminal emulator over a Citrix connection with a Windows PC on.
I'm telling you, man, we rock it for change, but we hate change. I mean, you look at us as people, we love change so much, but then we hate it when it comes down to changing anything that we do, right?
Right. Awesome. So if anyone hasn't checked out the book yet, his book is Hands-On Cloud Solutions with Azure, Architecting, Developing, and Deploying the Azure Way. And man, thanks so much, Greg, for being with me and finishing us out with the part 2.
No problem, my friend.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.